The other messaging was this 95% efficacy, which was a relative risk reduction. And how in the world do they get away with that?
Yeah, again, it's advertising hype. I mean, we had marketing guys running public health policy, because scientifically that was an outrageous claim. As you say, it wasn't absolute risk reduction, it was relative risk reduction. It was measured 2 months, on an average of 2 months of follow-up. And vaccines, if you're going to have them, you're interested in their efficacy over years, if not decades. Like yellow fever, we measure it over a lifetime. And the efficacy of these vaccines was being quoted based on 2 months of follow-up. Now, we know, because we had subsequent data, which not from the trials, but that was collected sort of indirectly, that the efficacy fell away to zero over 6 to 12 months. So if you took an average efficacy of these vaccines over 1 or 2 years, it would be close to zero. And yet they, for years and years, and still to this day, you'll still have people claiming, oh, these vaccines are 95% effective. That scientifically is again false, because you have to look at efficacy over time. You can't just take a peak efficacy figure and then say that's how effective the vaccine is. And if you look at these vaccines over, as I say, reasonable periods of time, even 1 to 2 years is a very short time, their efficacy would be much closer to zero than it would be to 95% in terms of preventing infection. We can talk about severe disease, which is really where the vaccines do have a benefit. But even that does wane, as we've seen with recent data published in the last few weeks, where it's showing that essentially after a year, there's no impact on hospitalization with the current mRNA vaccines. So even their benefit in terms of reducing severity of disease is short-lived.
It raises another part of the question, because as in clinical medicine, everything is about risk and benefit, So even if a particular intervention has a benefit, your question is, what is the risk, especially to do with all-cause mortality? Because sometimes risk is not about specifically what you're looking for. So other things outside of that can happen that you didn't anticipate. When they spoke about the risks with regards to vaccines, one of the things that had struck me is that they only counted adverse events 14 days after the second dose. Does that make any scientific sense?
No. So if you're looking at safety, that should be measured from the time of the intervention. If you're looking at efficacy, of course, then you tend to say, well, you only measure that from when the vaccine becomes effective. They're not instantly effective. So it's quite normal to say, okay, we'll measure effectiveness from 2 weeks after the second dose is quite a normal, depending on the vaccine, but that is quite normal. But you don't ignore side effects. All side effects from the very time of the dose have to be measured. Someone might have a heart attack, just as the vaccine's being injected, because, they're scared of needles, their blood pressure goes up, they have a heart attack. That heart attack is caused by the vaccine. So maybe not by the chemistry of the vaccine, but by the act of vaccinating the person, exposing them to that needle. In fact, some people have died actually just seeing the needle. Believe it or not, some people have dropped dead because some people are so needle phobic, it's enough to trigger a heart attack. That is a vaccine side effect, scientifically, because if you hadn't come at them with a needle, they wouldn't have had that heart attack. So even though you haven't yet injected the actual vaccine, it's still a vaccine side effect, that death. So again, it's not normal, as you say, to ignore all side effects in that time from the start of when you're giving the vaccine to a later time period. That's highly irregular.
And I'd take it further than that, because one of the things that I'd come across was, say, for instance, with the swine flu vaccine that caused narcolepsy, which the company still doesn't agree with, but payouts have been made across the world on it because it seems to be related to the vaccine. That can take a side effect that can take up to a year. Is it normal that after, say, about 42 days, it's almost as if you're not going to get side effects, and anything that happens beyond that is no longer relevant? I worry about that. Is that standard practice?
No, so, you know, the FDA particularly have always been worried about late onset side effects, particularly, you know, things like autoimmune disease, because autoimmunity doesn't just happen overnight. It often has a long lead-in period. Similarly, for instance, if I'm not saying vaccines cause cancer, but if a vaccine, you know, a technology or a chemical was to cause cancer, the cancer is not going to appear for years later. You know, if we were to look at, you know, carcinogenic agents, like, would you say we'll measure whether if you have your first cigarette in your life, we'll measure the incidence of lung cancer for 42 days after your first cigarette, and if you don't see lung cancer in that 42 days, we'll say that there's no possibility that cigarettes cause cancer. I think you'd
Wow.
agree that that would be nonsensical.
Absolutely, yes.
So it certainly is the case that if that you get acute side effects with vaccines, say you get a sore arm, it's unlikely you'll get a sore arm in a year's time from a vaccine. It's going to happen straight away. If you're going to get a fever from a vaccine, it's going to happen within a few days. So those, what we call reactogenicity events, absolutely, they'll occur within the 42 days. There's no point measuring them afterwards. But if you're thinking chronic disease and there's some potential, you know, for the, as I say, the chemicals that form part of that vaccine to cause long-term effects, then you have to look for years. And the FDA typically expect companies to look for that data, because even they, you know, are always worried about the potential for long-term side effects, not just short-term side effects.